A mocked farmer hosted a free dinner for the town, but just 3 days later, army tanks rolled in to honor him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. They called him Old Man Howell, the townsfolk who passed by his weather-beaten farmhouse on the outskirts of Willow Bend. If they were feeling generous, they might have called him eccentric. Most days, though, they called him foolish. He toiled on land everyone claimed was worthless. His fields, scattered with wild grass and stubborn patches of wheat, never seemed to yield enough harvest to turn a profit. And yet, year after year, he refused to leave. He refused to sell the property that his father, and his father's father before him, had painstakingly maintained through floods and droughts. "Get rid of that place," muttered the local grocer whenever Howell wandered into town for supplies. "Put it on the market, buy yourself a decent house on Main Street, and stop pretending it's 1950. The mockery didn't sting as much as it once did. Howell had grown used to the whispers, the snickers behind his back. He was nearly 70, thin from long hours in the sun, but wiry enough to sling sacks of seed across his shoulders. His hair hung wild beneath a dusty cap. The lines around his eyes told stories of heartbreak and perseverance, the kind that only old farmers and battered soldiers seemed to wear. On his best days, Howell just smiled at the gossip. On his worst, he'd stand outside in the yard, look up at the sky, and wonder if he truly was a fool for clinging to dreams that never bore fruit. His family was long gone. His wife, Josephine, had passed nearly 2 decades ago, and his only daughter moved to the city the first chance she got. But Howell never felt entirely alone. The wind that swept across his fields carried voices of the past, of generations who had worked this land with bare hands and unbreakable spirits. Their memories, etched into fence posts and tractor wheels, kept him rooted. Still, times were hard. The barn needed a new roof, and the tractor coughed like it was on its last breath. Neighbors wondered if Howell might just let go at last. Then, one morning, a flurry of paper invitations appeared on doorsteps across Willow Bend. The stationery was simple but charming, with curling letters that read, "You're cordially invited to dinner at Howell Farm. Everyone welcome. No charge. This Saturday." Confusion spread through the town. Some folks laughed outright. "The old man's gone senile," they said at the cafe, stirring sugar into chipped mugs. Others shook their heads. "If he's struggling to feed himself, how's he going to feed the whole town?" Local rumor turned into mild curiosity. By midday, the invitation had been passed around a dozen times, and each retelling added a fresh layer of mockery. "Reckon he's got a stash of canned beans in that dusty pantry of his," snickered one of the factory workers. "Or maybe he found a golden egg-laying goose in those worthless fields," teased another. Not everyone joined in the sneers. A few, especially the older folks who remembered Howell's father as a good-hearted man, felt an ache of concern. Why would a proud but broke farmer invite the entire community for a free meal? Some speculated it was a cry for help. Others said it was a last grand gesture before Howell lost everything. But despite the swirl of rumors, come Saturday, curiosity proved too strong to resist. By 5 in the evening, the dusty path leading to Howell Farm was alive with the crunch of tires on gravel. Families arrived in pickups and sedans that coughed at every pothole. Young men in flannel shirts hopped out to stretch their legs, gazing around with wary fascination at the battered barn and the acres of unremarkable farmland. Mothers held the hands of restless children, smoothing down hair and reminding them to mind your manners, even if the dinner's bound to be strange. In front of the barn, Old Man Howell had placed a long, rough-hewn table fashioned from spare planks of wood. Lanterns hung overhead, giving the place a warm, flickering glow that surprised people. The sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon in soft oranges and pinks. It was unexpectedly beautiful out here, folks realized. In their scurries about daily life, they'd never bothered to notice the sunset from Howell's land. They found Howell at the head of the table, wearing his best pair of faded overalls and a clean flannel. As he greeted each arrival with a lopsided smile and a gracious nod, more than one guest suppressed the urge to laugh at the simplicity of it all. Some did laugh, but under their breath. They spotted the chipped plates stacked near the table, the battered pots resting atop portable stoves, and the mismatched silverware. It looked more like an improvised picnic than a proper dinner party. But Howell kept on smiling, ushering them to sit wherever they liked. He said he was grateful they'd come, said it had been a long time since the old farm had so much company. The children gawked at the enormous pot of stew that Howell stirred with a wooden spoon nearly as tall as a toddler. Others eyed a stack of homemade cornbread, fresh from the oven. A sweet, yeasty aroma filled the cool evening air. For a moment, the gathering was hushed by the smells drifting across the yard. There was something undeniably welcoming about the place. Still, as more guests trickled in, a few men in crisp shirts snickered at Howell's donkey, which wandered around the perimeter as though it were an honored security guard. And when the donkey brayed, a ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd. "Would you look at that?" One of the local merchants scoffed. "Man can't afford a real tractor, so he's got that creature patrolling the party." Another joined in. "Didn't realize we'd get dinner and a petting zoo. Next time we'll charge him for the entertainment." Whispers mixed with the rising laughter as some guests started to wonder if the meal was even safe to eat. One woman turned to her friend and mumbled, "If he hasn't got 2 pennies to rub together, how'd he buy all this food?" Another quipped, "Maybe he's planning to pass around a donations jar once we're done." Yet the mocking quieted when Howell stepped forward, cleared his throat, and asked for everyone's attention. Despite the lines of weariness on his face, his voice was steady. "Thank you for coming," he said. "This old farm's seen better days, but I've been blessed in ways that ain't always about money. Tonight's not about what I can afford or can't. It's about gratitude. For the land, for the chance to keep living off it, and for the neighbors who make up this town." A handful of people felt a pang of shame at his earnestness, but the mood was still uncertain. The dinner proceeded. They ate stew from chipped bowls. They tore warm cornbread in half, passing pieces down the table. And as the meal went on, something unexpected happened. People began to enjoy themselves. Conversations sparked. The stew, surprisingly, was rich and hearty, brimming with vegetables and savory broth. The cornbread had a golden crust that tasted faintly of honey. Little by little, the tension eased. Even the critics of Howell's generosity found themselves, at least for the span of a meal, relaxing. Children ran circles around the donkey, giggling whenever it flicked its ears. Friends who seldom spoke outside of town gossip found themselves drawn together in conversation about the land, about the weather, about small memories they'd shared in passing. Howell hardly ate. He seemed content watching everyone else. He topped off water pitchers and offered more stew whenever a bowl neared empty. Nobody realized just how intently he was observing. He saw the sneers that lingered on a few faces, caught fragments of conversation that questioned his motives. He said nothing, only nodded kindly. When the last crumbs of cornbread vanished, Howell stood again. The murmuring crowd quieted to listen, expecting some sort of plea or request. Perhaps he'd ask for money to keep his farm afloat. Perhaps he'd propose a fundraiser or a partnership to cultivate the land. But he only said, "Thank you for letting me share a meal with you. It's meant more than you can guess. Please stop by any time. This place may not look like much, but it's home." Some gave polite applause. Others rolled their eyes, certain Howell would come knocking soon with his hat in hand, begging for a loan. Still, they offered stiff handshakes or brief goodbyes as they drifted back to their cars. One or two neighbors quietly slipped a few bills into Howell's coat pocket when he wasn't looking, small gestures of pity more than anything else. He discovered them later and placed them on the table, shaking his head slowly. In the following days, Willowbend fell back into its usual rhythm. People still talked about the dinner, of course. Some said it was the strangest evening they'd had in months. Others joked about the donkey. And more than one person claimed the stew must have been thickened with tears of desperation. A handful of folks, though, spoke with unexpected warmth about Howell's hospitality. They reminisced about that golden cornbread and how, for a fleeting moment, the farm felt like it was lit from within. Still, life moved on. No one expected anything more to come of it. Certainly no one suspected that a single shared meal would transform the fortunes of a man whose very name was synonymous with old-time stubbornness. Yet 3 days later, Willowbend woke to a sight that defied every ounce of logic. At the crack of dawn, the silence was broken by the low rumble of powerful engines. People hurried to their windows, half-dressed, curiosity morphing into alarm. The ground shook faintly, and as the sun's first rays cut across the horizon, the improbable silhouettes of army tanks emerged on the main road. Gasps rippled through the town. Children scrambled to the windows wide-eyed. Parents felt their hearts leap into their throats. An entire military convoy, tanks, transport vehicles, uniformed soldiers, was rolling down Willowbend's quiet streets, heading directly toward Howell Farm. Nobody knew why. Nobody had heard a single rumor that the military was passing through, let alone planning a stop. In a matter of minutes, phones started ringing in a wild chain of calls. Faces appeared at doorways. Anxious voices whispered and shouted questions. Why was the army here? Had there been some kind of national emergency? Had Old Man Howell gotten into serious trouble? People grabbed jackets, hopped into trucks, and drove toward Howell's land, desperate to see what was going on. Meanwhile, the enormous convoy turned onto Howell's dusty lane, crushing gravel under track and tire. One by one, the tanks lined up in front of the rickety farmhouse. Soldiers jumped off the transports, forming a neat row. At the center of them, all stood a tall man in a crisp uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. He removed his cap, gazing across the fields with an expression that was neither mocking nor pitying. Instead, it carried something like reverence. Then the tall officer walked straight up to Howell's front porch, passing the curious donkey that brayed in greeting. Across the road, townspeople gathered in clusters, keeping a fearful, fascinated distance. More arrived by the second, swirling with questions too big to contain. And there, on his porch, Old Man Howell appeared in the doorway, wearing the same dusty cap and scuffed boots they'd always known, only now. The lines in his face were lit with an emotion none of them could name. Nobody could have guessed that within the hour, the same folk who had snickered at that free dinner would stand witness to an honor rarely bestowed upon any civilian, let alone a humble farmer with a half-falling barn. Nor could they have predicted how this once mocked man would show them that quiet gestures often hold the greatest stories of all. Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, half the town clustered just beyond the gates of Howell Farm. A distant hum of speculation rippled through the crowd, so thick that barely anyone noticed the swirl of dust kicked up by the departing convoy trucks. All eyes were locked on the silent line of soldiers, standing as still as statues in their crisp uniforms. The tall officer who'd approached Old Man Howell now conferred with him on the porch, occasionally gesturing toward the half-collapsed barn and the field stretching behind it. At one point, Howell nodded, took off his weathered cap, and pressed it against his chest, as if absorbing news both glorious and grave. No one dared to shout questions across the distance. It felt almost sacrilegious to break the hush. But soon, an unexpected sound reverberated through the morning air, the metallic clang of a tank hatch opening. A soldier popped out, scanned the gathering townspeople, and stepped down, leading a second figure wearing a similar uniform. Together, they walked toward the farmhouse with steady, purposeful strides. Every onlooker craned their necks to see. Some recognized the insignia pinned on those shoulders and gasped. These were high-ranking officers. Why on earth would they come to Willowbend, let alone to an old farmer's porch? A few of Howell's closer neighbors, braver or more curious than the rest, inched forward until they reached the edge of his fence. Most of these watchers remembered mocking him just days prior. They exchanged uneasy looks, half expecting some dramatic revelation to tumble out at any second. Was Howell involved in something illegal? Was the land being seized for a new base? Their imaginations raged with possibilities. Suddenly, the tall officer turned and beckoned for the neighbors to come closer. Surprised, they did, forming a semicircle around the gate. Howell cleared his throat and spoke softly, though his voice carried in the hush. "Friends, I know this is a shock. I'm as stunned as any of you, but it seems the Army has come to pay respects. Not to me exactly, but to the legacy of someone someone who saved my life." A ripple of bafflement spread through the onlookers. The tall officer, whose name tag read Briggs, folded his arms behind his back. "It's more than that, Mr. Howell. We're here to honor your own service as well. But we understand you're a modest man. If you'd prefer, I can explain to your community why we've arrived." One might have heard a pin drop. Howell nodded, blinking back something that looked like tears. The day's events had already overset his usual composure. "Go ahead," he murmured. Officer Briggs turned to face the small crowd. "This farmland," he began, voice measured, "belongs to a man who once served in the 8th Infantry, though I suspect many folks here never knew it. Even fewer knew that during a deployment decades ago, he risked everything to shield a wounded soldier. That soldier was my father. Over the years, my father often spoke of the quiet hero who saved him, a man from Willowbend named Howell. My father passed a year ago, but he left instructions that, if I ever found Howell, I should personally deliver his gratitude, and the gratitude of the U.S. Army. We did some research, discovered Mr. Howell's location, and arranged to come here as soon as we had clearance." A tremor of amazement flickered across the listeners. A few older residents had vague memories of Howell leaving for the service as a young man, but no one had known the details. He'd never boasted, never displayed medals or told war stories at the local diner. The farmland had always been the entire shape of his identity in their eyes. Now, they were hearing that the man they'd teased for being stuck in the past had quietly carried a heroic secret all along. Briggs continued. "Yet, there's another reason we came. Our records indicate that for many years, Mr. Howell has been due a series of benefits he never claimed. In the Army's eyes, that's a debt on our part we need to rectify, particularly given the sacrifice made by him and by others who fought. What you see here," he gestured to the tanks and soldiers, "is the ceremonial aspect. We wanted to honor the memory of my father and to thank Mr. Howell for his service and heroism. It's not every day we get to fulfill such a personal promise." A stunned silence followed. Some of the townsfolk glanced guiltily at one another, recalling how they'd laughed at Howell's dinner invitation, how they'd whispered about his alleged lack of funds. The old man himself looked overwhelmed. He rubbed a hand over his mouth, as though trying to contain a flurry of emotions: grief for memories long buried, awe at the sudden attention, a quiet pride he'd never learned to express. Finally, a voice cut through the hush. It belonged to the local librarian, Mrs. Fletcher. "Mr. Howell," she said, stepping forward, "did you really serve in the 8th Infantry? You never said a word. You never even hinted—" He swallowed and cleared his throat. "It was a lifetime ago. Always figured I'd do better with my head in the soil than telling tales that might bring back ghosts." He paused, gaze drifting across the faces gathered there. "I lost good friends. Figured my story was no more important than anyone else's. Didn't see the point in rehashing it." That reticence, that unassuming humility, tugged at the hearts of the onlookers. Even the ones who had been the loudest mockers found themselves silent, wishing they'd known better. With a gentle nod, Officer Briggs placed a firm hand on Howell's shoulder. "My father never forgot," he said, voice thick with respect. "He only regretted losing touch. Now, if it's acceptable to you, sir, we'd like to conduct a brief ceremony here on your land. Nothing too grand, but a chance to present you with the official recognition you were long overdue." Howell's eyes flickered with an emotion between embarrassment and honor. "If that's what your father would have wanted, I won't refuse." Briggs turned to the ring of soldiers. "Company, form the line," he barked. With swift precision, they stepped into a formal arrangement. One soldier carried a folded flag. Another held a small case, presumably containing medals or citations. Briggs himself pulled an envelope from his pocket. Meanwhile, the crowd of townspeople, once curious or bemused, now felt the air hum with reverence. Where skepticism once hovered, respect slipped in. The donkey, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, brayed from the side of the yard. A few children stifled laughs. Howell patted the donkey's flank as if to assure it that all was well, though the donkey's timing was borderline comedic. Then Briggs signaled to a soldier who began reading from a statement. It chronicled the day Howell had rescued Briggs's father under heavy fire. How the action had saved not just one life, but several, because the soldier in question turned out to be a medic who went on to treat others. Over the hush of the farmland, that story brought tears to more than one pair of eyes. When the reading ended, the soldier saluted Howell. Another opened the small case, revealing a medal Howell had never collected. The old man's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, taking it into his hands with palpable astonishment. He didn't seem sure where to set his gaze, on the medal, on the officer, or on the crowd who watched in silent awe. Eventually his eyes settled on the horizon, as if searching for the friends he'd left behind in that faraway conflict. A few townspeople sniffled or dabbed at their eyes. One of them, the very fellow who'd teased Howell's donkey at the dinner, muttered something about how they'd all been so wrong. Others nodded in agreement, feeling regret swirl in their chests. Even the youngest onlookers sensed this was no ordinary event. Children who seldom stood still fidgeted but kept quiet, as though they understood on some instinctive level that they were witnessing a turning point for their community. Then came a second surprise. Briggs respectfully placed a thick envelope in Howell's hands. "Sir, these are documents regarding your benefits, along with resources for farm assistance. We also included contact details should you need further help. You've been overlooked for far too long." The old man blinked at the official stamps and seals. Carefully he ran his thumb over the envelope's edge. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Such a gesture might solve the very financial woes that had dogged Howell's steps for years. If that meant new equipment, a repaired barn roof, or maybe even a chance for him to breathe easy for the first time in decades, who could mock him for that? Gently, Howell cleared his throat. He faced the crowd, his voice trembling a bit but carrying more strength than usual. I don't know how to thank you," he said, eyes shining in the morning light. "Didn't reckon I deserved anything special. I did what any man would do, looking out for someone who needed help. As for this farm, it stayed in my family for generations. And I guess I only kept it going because I couldn't stand letting down the folks who came before. Never thought I might actually get ahead. It's kind of you to do all this. Kind beyond anything I've known." The hush persisted. Some onlookers lowered their heads. They remembered the dinner just a few nights ago, how they'd ridiculed his generosity, called it strange and worthless. They recalled how they'd questioned whether he was just pulling some stunt. And now, they stood face to face with a man who'd not only proven his generosity, but who bore the quiet bravery of a true hero. Officer Briggs nodded respectfully. "From now on, if you need anything, please reach out. My men and I will always remember your service. My father certainly did." At that, he gave Howell a sharp salute. The soldiers followed suit in perfect unison, rifles resting at ceremonial angles. The donkey brayed once more, as if offended by the formality, but the moment remained solemn. Then, as if awakened by some shared realization, townspeople began stepping forward. Tentatively at first, then more boldly. One by one they approached Howell on the porch. Mrs. Fletcher gently touched the old man's arm, murmuring a soft apology for years of misunderstanding. The local mechanic, who once called him that stubborn old coot, took off his greasy cap and shook Howell's hand with genuine respect. Even the factory worker who joked about the donkey offered a heartfelt word of thanks, acknowledging that Howell's free dinner had been less about showing off and more about sharing goodwill in a world that rarely slows down long enough to remember one another's humanity. Before long, the entire gathering had formed a circle around Howell. Some snapped pictures with shaky camera phones. Others simply stood, letting the enormity of the morning sink in. Howell fiddled with the metal in his hands, looking both proud and embarrassed by the attention. A hush lingered until a timid voice spoke up. "Would it be all right if we maybe sang the national anthem?" It was a suggestion from the butcher's daughter, who'd come to see the tanks. Officer Briggs raised an eyebrow, then nodded with a small smile. A hush fell, followed by the uncertain start of a melody. But soon the small crowd found the rhythm, and voices merged in a trembling chorus. As they sang, Howell seemed to struggle with tears. He kept a hand pressed over his heart, eyes shining with a mix of pride and sorrow. The donkey, perhaps sensing the solemn mood, stayed blessedly quiet during the song. When it ended, there were no cheers, just a deep, collective exhalation. The soldiers began to pack up, methodically returning to their vehicles. Briggs gave one final handshake to Howell, then to a few townspeople, promising to stay in touch. Engines roared to life, and as the convoy slowly maneuvered away from the farmhouse, a swirl of dust rose again. People pressed hands to their faces to shield their eyes, watching as the massive tanks rumbled down the lane, eventually disappearing from sight. In the aftermath, nobody knew quite what to say. Many turned to Howell, searching for some final word of thanks. But the old man just nodded, still clutching that envelope like a lifeline. "Thank you all for coming," he managed at last, echoing the same words he'd spoken at that dinner. Only now, no one found it laughable. No one mocked the donkey, the chipped bowls, or the man who had tried to feed them all. The hush lingered until Mrs. Fletcher murmured, "Maybe we can help you fix up the barn with those new funds, Mr. Howell. My nephew's a handyman. You name it, we'll rally folks to lend a hand." She shot a glance at the mechanic and the factory workers, who nodded eagerly, silently determined to right past wrongs. In the days after the tanks departed, Howell's farm bustled with newfound purpose. Townspeople who once scoffed at him arrived bearing lumber, nails, and paint. Under Mrs. Fletcher's gentle direction, they began repairing the sagging barn roof, patching rotted boards, and restoring windows that had long stood, cracked. Despite Howell's protests, a steady stream of volunteers showed up daily. Young men learned carpentry alongside retired tradesmen. Parents supervised children as they lugged scraps to a growing woodpile. Howell marveled at how quickly suspicion could shift to solidarity. He watched, grateful yet overwhelmed, as busy hands revived the farm's tired heart. The barn's transformation inspired a ripple of reflection throughout Willow Bend. People remembered how they had dismissed Howell's character for years, labeling him a relic. Now they recognized how blind they had been to his unwavering dedication. Some apologized openly, while others simply dropped by with fresh bread or apple pies. The donkey, once derided as a sad spectacle, trotted around like an unofficial mascot, receiving pats and carrots from amused children. Howell, unused to attention, tried to repay every kindness with heartfelt cornbread loaves. Yet no matter his efforts, the generosity coming his way seemed to multiply day by day. Autumn's onset provided the perfect backdrop for this communal shift. Leaves burned with gold and copper shades, swirling around fences Howell had mended by hand. The official army assistance also arrived, granting him overdue benefits. He used those funds judiciously, updating his ancient tractor, settling old debts, and improving irrigation. Each morning he'd wander out with a cup of coffee, tipping his head to greet neighbors already gathered for barn repairs. Sometimes he'd quietly watch them work. Remembering the profound hush of that military ceremony, he felt a stirring gratitude he had trouble expressing, but each gesture spoke volumes indeed. One afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher suggested hosting a harvest luncheon on Howell's property to celebrate the barn's near completion. Gossip spread, and soon half the town volunteered to bring casseroles, pies, and fresh cider. Howell, initially reluctant, warmed to the idea when he realized how eager folks were. On the day of the event, tables lined the yard, heaped with steaming dishes. Children played tag between piles of hay bales. Howell's donkey, bedecked in a ribbon, nibbled stray carrot tops. Amidst the bustle, Howell found himself recalling the small seed of kindness he had planted with that free dinner months earlier. The luncheon surpassed all expectations. Laughter mingled with the aroma of spiced apple cider, and even those who once rolled their eyes at Howell's generosity found themselves trading friendly banter. Old grudges seemed to vanish amid offers to refill plates. Between bites, Howell heard references to new projects: a town co-op, a weekly produce market, and a repair circle for elderly homeowners. Pride flickered in his chest, no longer tinged with self-consciousness. By evening, the last guests departed with full bellies and lighter hearts. Howell stood by his porch, donkey at his side, marveling at how far everyone had come. That night, he couldn't sleep. Memories of the army ceremony mingled with older recollections from the battlefield. He saw the face of the wounded soldier he'd rescued and remembered how fear had iced his veins until he forced himself to act. Quietly, Howell rose and took out the photograph sent by Officer Briggs. He stared at the inscription, a simple, heartfelt testament to his actions. Drawing a deep breath, he prayed for the souls he had known in that war, truly grateful his own remained. Eventually, dawn arrived, revealing bright skies that carried the promise of yet another hopeful day. During those early hours, Howell embraced a fresh routine. He strolled across fields still damp with dew, testing new seeds recommended by the agricultural agent. The donkey trailed behind, occasionally snorting at crows. Sometimes Howell paused near the rebuilt barn, admiring the sturdy beams and the sharp scent of new lumber. He pictured how his father would have grinned at its renewed glory. Over time, the entire property glowed with prosperity. Fields once considered meager now flourished under better care. The small orchard bore plump apples, and the battered farmhouse boasted a repaired roof, completely shielded at last from leaks. Word of Willowbend's revival spread across neighboring towns. Curiosity seekers came to glimpse the place that an army convoy had visited. Some offered to buy fresh produce directly from Howell, intrigued by the story of his farmland's rebirth. Instead of hoarding profit, Howell began donating portions of each sale to a newly formed community fund aimed at upgrading the local school's library. He recalled how Josephine once taught children to read under a flickering lamp, her gentle voice urging them toward bigger dreams. Honoring her memory felt right. Thus, the farm's bounty became a gift shared well beyond its fences. On a crisp morning, the sound of an engine announced an unexpected visitor. Officer Briggs, dressed in civilian clothes. Howell rushed out, donkey following with inquisitive eyes. Briggs explained he was passing through for military business and had to stop by. The two men shook hands warmly, then retreated to the porch where mugs of tea waited. Briggs marveled at the transformed barn and thriving fields, remarking how the place seemed worlds away from that solemn ceremony. Howell responded that the ceremony had changed everything. "It's like the land woke up," he said, voice husky with gratitude he still felt. Briggs then delivered a message from his late father's relatives, who had learned of Howell's quiet heroism. They hoped to visit someday, to meet the man who saved a piece of their family's history. Howell felt humbled by the notion that his one wartime act echoed across generations. Overwhelmed, he could only stammer his welcome. Before departing, Briggs placed a small box on the porch. "My father wanted you to have this," he explained. Inside lay a simple dog tag engraved with Howell's name and date of that long-ago rescue. Once alone, Howell clutched the tag, tears blurring his vision. As autumn deepened, evenings turned chilly, yet the warmth of community spirit never waned. Neighbors spontaneously organized a coat drive for low-income families, storing donations in Howell's newly functional barn. He noticed how each philanthropic effort gathered steam faster than the last, as though people had finally discovered a shared moral compass. When Mrs. Fletcher announced plans for a seasonal festival, everyone pitched in. Stalls of homemade crafts sprouted, and local musicians offered to play for free. Howell marveled at how quickly Willowbend had shifted from grudging isolation to collaborative pride. The donkey, of course, remained star of every gathering. One crisp afternoon, Howell received a telephone call from an unexpected source, a television station in the state capital. They wished to produce a short feature on the farmer who united a town with one free meal. Embarrassed, Howell tried to decline, but Mrs. Fletcher insisted he accept. When the news crew arrived, they interviewed residents who attested to how the farm's revival triggered newfound cooperation. Cameras captured shots of Howell's orchard, the freshly painted barn, and the donkey snorting in protest. Later, the news piece aired statewide, and letters of admiration poured in, lauding Howell's unassuming but powerful example. Through it all, Howell remained rooted in simple routines. Each sunrise found him carrying water buckets or hoeing neat rows for the next planting. He shared surplus produce with neighbors and welcomed visiting strangers like old friends. Sometimes, he'd hold that dog tag Briggs left, contemplating the tenuous line between life and fate. Other times, he'd gaze across fields once deemed hopeless, now brimming with promise. And, every so often, he revisited the memory of that free dinner, initially met with scorn, that sparked a chain of events leading to tanks on his lawn and a newfound bond with the world beyond. As winter approached, Willowbend braced for shorter days and frosty mornings. Howell, accustomed to decades of rough weather, took comfort in the orchard's final harvest, gathering apples with neighbors who turned them into pies and preserves. During these communal sessions, the donkey, now affectionately dubbed Sergeant, ambled around the yard with an air of command, braying whenever the apple baskets overflowed. Meanwhile, the local repair circle busied itself insulating old houses, ensuring no family faced the winter chill unprepared. Under the barn's high rafters, Mrs. Fletcher and some volunteers organized a coat drive, stacking warm jackets in neatly labeled boxes bound for folks in need. Howell, never one for speeches, thanked everyone by quietly passing around mugs of hot cider. The farm, once ridiculed, now served as an unofficial hub for any charitable effort that sprouted in Willowbend. On many evenings, a small group lingered after chores, huddling around portable heaters in the barn's newly restored interior. They would trade jokes, share local news, and admire the swirling dust motes illuminated by a single overhead lamp. Someone would open a pack of cookies or leftover pie, offering slices to the rest. Howell often listened more than he talked, soaking in the camaraderie that until recently had seemed impossible. He marveled at the genuine warmth, bridging folks who used to dismiss him as eccentric. Perhaps, he mused, all it ever took was a single invitation to dinner and a swirl of unexpected events to rekindle that neighborly spirit. But not everyone embraced this new era. A small faction in town, resentful of the attention Willowbend was receiving, began muttering that the Howell phenomenon had gone too far. They disliked the influx of reporters who occasionally popped by, hoping for a sentimental follow-up to the Army's visit. Some local business owners feared that coverage of Howell's charitable initiatives was overshadowing their own enterprises. One merchant griped, "Everybody praises that farm, but they forget our store is still the backbone of Main Street." Rumors spread that new investors were sniffing around Willowbend, eager to harness its sudden fame for personal profit. It was during this uneasy undercurrent that Howell received a letter from an unfamiliar firm in the city, proposing to buy a share of his land. They claimed they could turn part of the acreage into a premium resort. Casual mention of rolling farmland vistas to lure city dwellers looking for rustic luxury. Howell stared at the letter in disbelief. The figure they quoted was sizable, enough for him to live comfortably for the rest of his days. But the thought of paved parking lots on soil his father had tilled made his stomach twist. He read the letter aloud to Mrs. Fletcher, who had stopped by with a bundle of scarves for donation. She pursed her lips. "Sounds like they want to cash in on your story," she said, glancing around the barn. "But how would you feel about buses of tourists trampling over the orchard?" He set the letter down. "I'd feel like I sold my soul," he said quietly. "I don't want to disrespect those who came before me. This land, it's not just real estate, it's a legacy." Word of the offer trickled out, fueling more debate. Some townsfolk urged him to take the deal. "Think of the economic boost," they insisted. "You could help more people if you had that money." Others, mindful of the farm's heritage, urged caution. Howell's inner circle, especially the volunteers, respectfully reminded him that the orchard and fields had become a communal symbol of renewal. Tearing them up for a resort seemed like a betrayal of the unity they had built. Yet the confusion persisted. Howell felt torn between the possibility of financial security and his deep affection for the land. At night, he could hardly sleep, replaying the pros and cons in his mind. He considered how Josephine used to say, "Sometimes money just isn't worth losing what you love." Despite the farm's new vitality, old insecurities still gnawed at him. The donkey, sensing his tension, would stomp restlessly outside his bedroom window, as though urging him to stay true. One day, a well-dressed representative from the investment group arrived unannounced. He drove a shiny car that looked out of place amid the dusty roads. Spotting Howell near the fence, the man emerged with a broad grin and a handshake that felt too polished. Introductions were swift. "Name's Carlson from Heartland Developments," he said, flashing business cards. "We're excited about the potential here. This region is trending in travel magazines, all because of your remarkable story. We could partner, help you develop farmland into a profitable retreat." Howell's donkey brayed, startling Carlson. "And I see you've got local charm to spare," he added with forced cheer, stepping away from the inquisitive animal. Howell simply folded his arms, scanning the man's gold cufflinks. Carlson launched into a spiel about luxury cabins, on-site spa treatments, farm-to-table dining. Howell stood unmoving, expression unreadable. Finally, he explained that he appreciated the interest, but no decisions had been made. Carlson tried to press further, but Howell excused himself politely, saying he had chores. After the visitor left, Howell felt a headache bloom behind his temples. He trudged inside, finding the donkey trailing behind. Sitting at the old kitchen table, he reread the letter from the firm. A large figure indeed, enough to ensure future generations never struggled like he had. But he pictured the orchard, lined with asphalt walkways, the barn becoming a gift shop. The thought felt like watching his father's memory crumble into dust. Determined to clear his mind, Howell headed to the orchard, where he found a group of neighbors pruning branches for winter. Pausing to watch them laugh and cooperate, he recalled how improbable such unity once seemed. Everyone had discovered joy in the simplest tasks, tying ribbons to mark diseased limbs or hauling wheelbarrows of cuttings. He realized that this orchard, once scraggly and neglected, now stood as proof that healing was possible for both land and community. Spying Howell's troubled expression, a neighbor asked if anything was wrong. The old farmer hesitated, then admitted, "I've had an offer to sell a chunk of the place for a resort. Not sure what to do." Instantly, a hush fell over the orchard. Some gasped, others frowned. The tension was palpable. Eventually, Mrs. Fletcher spoke up. "Whatever you decide, we'll respect, but this orchard saved us in a way. We found ourselves again while rebuilding it. Please don't let money take that away." A faint nod was all Howell could manage. He recognized how deeply the orchard's rebirth had woven into the town's identity. He patted the donkey's nose, pondering the weight of that responsibility. For days afterward, he avoided calls from Carlson, immersing himself in winter prep instead. He mended fences, stored equipment, and shared leftover produce with the local food pantry. Each time the phone rang, he debated picking it up, but an uneasy feeling always stopped him. With time, the local rumor mill churned again. Some said Howell was too sentimental, that turning down a fortune was reckless. Others said he should do it, then donate profits to transform Willowbend further. But Howell's oldest allies recognized his struggle. Late one afternoon, in the barn's new warmth, they organized a quiet meeting. Over steaming cups of tea, they urged him to do what felt right, not what others dictated. One friend said softly, "Your heart has steered us this far. It hasn't failed yet." He smiled ruefully. "I'm no prophet," he answered. "I just can't stand the idea of losing what we built. My father once taught me that good land is a partner, not a commodity." Winter descended in earnest. Frost sparkled across fences each morning, and the donkey's breath emerged in puffs as it wandered the yard. Howell, after weeks of thought, made a decision. He wrote a letter back to the investment group, thanking them but declining. Using slow, deliberate strokes of his pen, he explained that the farm was more than mere acreage. It was the heart of a community reborn. He politely invited them to direct their interest elsewhere, leaving Willowbend's orchard as it stood. The day he mailed the letter, Howell felt both relieved and anxious. Had he thrown away the chance of a lifetime? Or saved everything that truly mattered? That evening, he told Mrs. Fletcher and the other volunteers what he'd done. A palpable sigh of relief washed through them. Somebody jokingly offered to throw a no-sale celebration. Others teased the donkey, awarding it a token chief security role for scaring away pushy investors. Laughter echoed in the barn as they raised mugs of cider to a farmland that remained proudly their own. Then Howell realized something. Through the swirl of new opportunities, reawakened unity, and lingering doubts, one truth stood firm. The quiet dinner he'd once offered, mocked by so many, had become a seed. And that seed had sprouted into a fellowship none had anticipated, nurtured by respect and generosity. He gazed around at the warm barn, at Sergeant the donkey nosing for treats, at neighbors who'd grown into dear friends, and understood that every measure of wealth he required was already here. Winter wore on, and a brittle chill settled over Howell Farm. Ice sheathed the upper branches in the orchard, making them glitter under pale sunlight. Some mornings Howell woke to find the donkey, Sergeant, scraping at frozen patches of grass, his brays echoing against the quiet fields. The donkey's breath hung in the crisp air, reminding Howell that the land still needed constant tending, even in its dormant season. There was kindling to split, pathways to shovel, and the livestock to look after. Where once he faced these tasks in solitude, now a handful of neighbors regularly appeared at dawn, stamping their boots free of snow. They came for no pay, only for the camaraderie, and perhaps to enjoy Howell's hearty breakfast of eggs and biscuits. The no-sale celebration, originally a light-hearted joke, grew into a full-fledged festival. Mrs. Fletcher took charge, printing small flyers that read, "To the farm that wouldn't sell, a day of gratitude." Date and time were set for mid-December, timed so families could bring holiday spirit along with their goodwill. Curiosity swelled in town. People wondered how large the turnout might be, especially with the weather turning harsh. But when the day arrived, the sky gleamed a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air carried a vibrant snap of cold that was somehow invigorating. Locals and even a few out-of-towners showed up in scarves and mittens, greeting each other with visible puffs of breath. Tables and chairs once again sprang up in the clearing between the barn and orchard. Folks piled them high with seasonal dishes, pumpkin soup, roasted vegetables, apple pies, and cranberry tarts. A small group of amateur musicians lined up near the tractor, picking out tunes on fiddles and guitars. Children scampered around, building miniature snowmen under the orchard's skeleton trees. The donkey, bedecked in a fresh red ribbon courtesy of the local seamstress, strolled between guests, munching stray carrot tops whenever someone offered. Everything felt cozy, bright, and well-earned. Howell, wearing his oldest jacket and that battered cap, moved through the crowd with the slightest hint of wonder. He saw families taking pictures by the barn's repaired doors, heard laughter from old friends he'd once assumed wanted nothing to do with him, and felt an odd sort of peace settle deep in his bones. Mrs. Fletcher arranged a short ceremony to commemorate Howell's decision. She stood on a small wooden crate so the crowd could see her properly. Clearing her throat, she proclaimed that Willow Bend was grateful. Grateful he'd stayed true to the land, grateful that a community had rediscovered its heart through a humble farm, and grateful that no chain of resorts would shatter the town's essence. At the close of her speech, applause rippled out in waves. Some folks whistled, others simply clapped with broad grins. Blushing at all the fuss, Howell tried to wave it off, but Mrs. Fletcher handed him a large card signed by half the county. The inside read, "Thank you for reminding us that the land can hold more than crops. It can hold our community." In the midst of this collective warmth, a dusty sedan crept up the lane. A stranger stepped out, pale from the cold, wearing a slightly crumpled overcoat. With uncertain steps, he approached the gathering. Eyes flicked over warily. None recognized him, though his posture seemed hesitant, almost apologetic. Howell, noticing the newcomer's confusion, invited him to join. Sergeant the donkey nudged the man's arm as if to say hello. The stranger hesitated, then patted the donkey's neck with a faint smile. As the festival's music resumed, he hung back, observing from a polite distance. Later, Howell found the stranger by the orchard fence, studying the bare trees. "You all right?" Howell asked, keeping his voice gentle. The man turned, startled. His features wore the signs of sleepless nights, a pinched brow, wary eyes. "I'm fine, just sorry to intrude. Saw the crowd and thought maybe, well, it doesn't matter." He tried to wave it off, but Howell prodded gently. Eventually, the stranger admitted he'd lost his job up north and was driving south looking for temporary work. The swirl of activity on the farm caught his eye. "I guess I hoped to ask if there were any odd jobs I could do in exchange for a hot meal." Howell sized up the man's threadbare coat, the frayed edges on his sleeves. "Plenty of chores need doing around here," he said. "You eat first, then we can talk about chores tomorrow." The man's shoulders sagged in relief. Howell led him to the tables and introduced him to a few volunteers. Soon the newcomer was devouring a bowl of soup, cheeks reddening in gratitude. Afterward, neighbors helped him find a spare blanket and space to rest in a corner of the barn if he needed. The shift from suspicion to welcome happened fast. Folks had learned from Howell's example. That evening, once the festival wrapped up and the last visitors trickled away, Howell lingered in the barn. The donkey snorted softly, searching for leftover treats. Outside, stars shone with icy brilliance. The newcomer, who'd introduced himself as Patrick, leaned on a post, thanking Howell yet again. "Never met a place so open-hearted," he murmured. Howell only smiled and said he'd once hosted a free dinner that nobody understood, until life surprised them all. Patrick didn't ask questions, sensing there was more to the tale than Howell cared to explain right then. Instead, he offered to wake early and shovel snow. They shook hands on it, sealing a moment of trust neither had expected at dawn. Days turned to weeks, and the arrangement proved fruitful. Patrick was indeed handy, repairing small machinery, tending orchard branches that threatened to snap under winter's weight, and feeding Sergeant whenever Howell got busy. In return, he slept in a nook of the barn and shared in the farm's meals. Gradually, he confided that he'd been drifting from town to town since losing his factory job, feeling invisible and disillusioned. Willow Bend, with its tight-knit warmth, felt like a revelation he wasn't sure he deserved. Howell listened without judgment, remembering his own sense of isolation before the community's transformation. He told Patrick he was free to stay as long as he kept being helpful. The younger man nodded, eyes wet with gratitude. But not everyone welcomed an outsider so readily. A few townsfolk grumbled, worried that more strangers might arrive, hoping to share in Howell's good fortune without contributing. Whispers circulated about opportunists and moochers. Yet, when Mrs. Fletcher and others reminded them that Howell's generosity had sparked Willowbend's revival, most recognized that turning suspicious now would unravel all they'd built. And indeed, Patrick proved he wasn't just a taker. He quietly volunteered at the coat drive, repaired a neighbor's broken gate for free, and shoveled driveways whenever someone needed help. Before long, he was no longer just that drifter, but a familiar face who greeted people politely at the diner or in the post office line. By midwinter, a calm settled over Willowbend. The orchard's branches seemed to slumber under a thin coat of snow. Icicles dripped from the barn eaves during midday thaws, glittering in bright sun. Howell often roamed the property with Patrick and Sargent in tow, checking fences and scattered feed troughs. Sometimes they'd stand at the orchard's edge, imagining how buds might burst forth come spring. Those fields, once ridiculed, had become a symbol of renewal. And for Patrick, it was a testament to second chances. One blustery evening, as the sun dipped behind frosted hills, Patrick timidly asked Howell if he might stay indefinitely, maybe find proper lodging in town, but keep working at the farm. "I want to put down roots," he said, eyes earnest. "If that's all right." Howell paused, memories dancing behind his gaze. He recalled how lonely he'd felt for so many years, yearning for even a few extra hands to keep the place thriving. Now it wasn't just about an extra hand. It was about watching someone else find hope in the land that had once felt so forsaken. He nodded and said yes. They shook again, with the donkey braying approval. That night, they warmed themselves by the small fireplace in Howell's kitchen, sipping steaming cocoa. A sense of peace hovered in the air. Howell asked Patrick about his plans beyond orchard chores, and Patrick admitted he wanted to learn more about planting and harvest cycles. He'd never farmed, but the orchard's rebirth had stirred something in him. Howell grinned, started talking about crop rotation, about the almanac's predictions for precipitation, and about how to respect the rhythm of each season. As they talked, windows rattled in the wind. But inside there was comfort, an anchor in the shared dream of better days. Beyond the farm, Willowbend's winter marched forward. The local diner set up a small reading corner for kids, stocked with books from that library fund Howell had been supporting. The mechanic offered half-price snow tire installments for families in tight financial spots, citing the farm's example of giving. Nearly every household reported some little story of kindness, from groceries dropped at an elderly resident's door to free babysitting for single parents. The sense of synergy that began in Howell's fields now branched through the entire community, each gesture another gentle spark lighting the cold months. In mid-February, a sudden snowstorm blanketed the county. Roads became impassable, and power flickered out in pockets of the region. At Howell Farm, he and Patrick lit old kerosene lamps stored in the barn. In the orchard, trees bent under thick layers of snow, and Howell feared branches snapping. Yet, through the swirling gusts, headlights appeared. Neighbors arriving on tractors with plows, scraping the lane clear. Others showed up with chainsaws for downed limbs, forging paths so that if families needed help, they could get through. Howell stood in the barn doorway, lamp held high. The donkey stomped at the swirling drifts, as if personally offended, but everyone worked tirelessly into the night, ensuring the orchard and the farm were secure. When dawn finally broke, revealing a landscape of glittering white, Howell looked out at the orchard. There, amid drifts piled around the trunks, he spotted Patrick and two other neighbors knocking snow off delicate branches. They handled the limbs like precious artifacts, each gesture careful and protective. Soon, the trees stood free of that crushing weight, as if unburdened by the night's fury. Howell's chest tightened with a quiet joy. That orchard, once dismissed as worthless, now commanded the steadfast care of many hands. The rest of winter passed in relative calm, marked by occasional frosty gusts and a few more communal gatherings in the barn. Word spread that spring might arrive early, teased by mild afternoons that melted the top layers of snow. Howell found his spirits lifting each time he glimpsed those orchard rows. Visions of blossoms danced in his mind. He thought about how, for so long, the place had been lonely. Now it was alive with footsteps, voices, laughter, even a donkey's bray. He realized something. Generosity, once met with scorn, had not only survived but flourished, like a seed planted in seemingly barren ground. And soon, with spring's warmth, that seed would bloom. Winter loosened its grip in subtle ways. The once pristine snowdrifts shrank daily, revealing muddy patches along fence lines. Icicles on the barn eaves dripped steady rivulets that traced dark lines in the fresh paint. Occasionally, a warm breeze slipped through the orchard, and Howell found himself inhaling the thawing earth's scent. Those hints of impending spring caused flutters of hope among the volunteers who still visited the farm, checking on chores while sharing gossip about any new arrivals. Patrick, for his part, roamed the orchard in wonder, studying the bark on dormant branches and asking Howell how soon blossoms might appear. "Soon enough," the old man would say, cradling the donkey's muzzle. "But the season comes when it wills. We can't force the land to hurry." Patrick nodded, absorbing lessons in patience. He'd never seen a fruit orchard wake from winter before. Each day he scribbled notes in a spiral-bound notebook, small observations about temperature, moisture, and the orchard's general condition. Often, Howell teased him kindly, joking that he'd never bothered with so many measurements. But inwardly, he admired Patrick's diligence. The younger man's enthusiasm lit up the farm with fresh energy. On weekends, families arrived too, hoping for a glimpse of buds on those branches. They'd leave footprints across the softening snow, cheeks rosy from crisp air, and promise to return once petals finally burst forth. During this transition, Howell quietly mulled over a new idea. With the orchard now healthy enough to produce a respectable harvest, perhaps it was time to launch a small business supplying fresh apples and related goods. Several neighbors had already asked if they could buy future fruit in bulk. One offered to handle deliveries if Howell's truck struggled. Another suggested turning part of the barn into a cider press, though that would require extra machinery. Late at night, Howell would flip through pamphlets provided by the agriculture extension agent, learning about orchard management strategies and permits needed for wholesale. He relished the possibility of sustaining the farm through honest labor rather than outside investors, yet the notion intimidated him more than a little. Meanwhile, local kids began whispering about an upcoming school project, a spring fair. Their teachers wanted to highlight Willow Bend's transformation in the last year, calling it a prime example of community resilience. Pupils were assigned to create displays about local landmarks, and rumor had it that many groups wanted to feature Howell Farm. The donkey, especially, had become a minor celebrity among children who adored his stubborn antics and the bright ribbons often braided into his mane. Word reached Howell that he might get an invitation to speak at the fair. The thought made him chuckle. Public speaking wasn't his forte, but he braced himself for the possibility. Patrick heard the rumors too, and one snowy morning, while hauling feed buckets, he ventured a question. "How would you feel about letting some of those kids paint a mural on the side of the barn? I heard them talk about it at the diner." Howell paused, brow furrowed. "A mural? You mean big pictures? Bright colors?" He'd grown so accustomed to the barn's plain red boards that imagining a huge painting gave him pause. "Guess I don't mind if it's tasteful, but I'd hate to see it covered in cartoon doodles." Patrick shrugged. They sounded sincere about wanting to honor the farm's history. Maybe farmland scenes, orchard blossoms, and the donkey. Howell scratched Sargent's nose as he considered. Well, if it helps the town, let's give it a shot. Indeed, by early March, teachers and a cluster of art-minded teenagers approached Howell, brimming with ideas for the barn mural. They carried sketches showing rolling hills, orchard trees brimming with fruit, and a nod to the army tanks that had once visited. In the corner of each draft, a tiny donkey stood braying happily. Howell was speechless, moved by their eagerness to celebrate the events that had changed so many lives. He admitted that he'd never have guessed people would cherish the farm's story. One student beamed and said, "You showed us that kindness can spark big changes, Mr. Howell. We want to remember that every time we look at your barn." With a smile, Howell gave them the green light. Conditions were still too chilly for painting outdoors, so they agreed to wait until true springtime warmth arrived. But the planning sessions commenced in the school art room, with teens debating color choices and composition. Patrick sometimes dropped by to offer suggestions, having developed a surprising eye for design from his traveling days. Together, they assembled piles of paints and brushes, eager for the day the barn walls would be dry enough for their brushes to dance across those boards. Finally, April dawned mild and bright. Snow melted into the thirsty ground, and small green buds began appearing at the tips of orchard branches. Howell and Patrick walked the rows daily, marveling at the slow spread of life. The donkey trotted behind, carefully stepping around puddles. Neighbors joined in, snapping pictures of the orchard's metamorphosis. By week's end, the first hints of pearly blossoms emerged. Delighted gasps echoed among visitors. Children on field trips squealed when they saw those delicate flowers, petting Sargent and asking Howell endless questions about pollination. He answered with modest confidence, remembering half of what he'd read in those pamphlets. Amid the orchard's transformation, the barn mural project swung into action. A group of teenagers arrived one Saturday morning, carrying ladders, paint cans, and boundless enthusiasm. They taped outlines, sketched rough designs, and spent hours applying the first layers of color. Howell watched from a distance, half anxious they might slip from the ladders, half mesmerized by their skill. At midday, the donkey stuck his head into a paint bucket, earning shrieks of laughter and a quick rescue. By late afternoon, broad strokes of green and blue covered the barn's lower sections, while high up near the eaves, glimpses of farmland scenes came into focus. Throughout April, the mural grew in complexity. One corner depicted a golden field reminiscent of Howell's harvest potential. Another captured the orchard in full bloom, with vibrant pink and white petals framed against sunny skies. And near the center, an understated silhouette of a military tank appeared, tastefully done, accompanied by a soldier saluting. As for the donkey, it had been painted more than once, a small cameo near the door, then another larger image braying happily beside orchard trees. Patrick contributed by carefully painting tiny blossoms, dotting them across the orchard section like confetti. When the final touches dried, the barn looked like a glorious tapestry of the farm's history and the community's rebirth. The unveiling drew a crowd. Families arrived with picnic blankets, listening to a few words of gratitude from the school's art teacher and the teenage painters. Howell, coaxed into a brief speech, thanked everyone for what they'd done, saying he'd wake each morning to see that mural and remember how Willowbend had once come together against all odds. A round of applause followed, mingled with appreciative whistles. At the rear of the crowd, Patrick stood with a quiet smile, recalling how just a few months ago he'd been a drifter with no sense of belonging. Now, he felt anchored in a place that embraced him and a dream he'd slowly learned to cherish. That same afternoon, a breeze swept through the orchard, scattering blossoms like snowfall. Children dashed beneath the drifting petals, squealing in delight, while the donkey snorted, suspicious of the sudden shower. Howell gazed at the swirling color and realized he was truly at peace. For years, the farm had been his lonely fortress, and now it was alive with songs, laughter, and purposeful work. The orchard that once seemed doomed thrived under shared care, and the barn's bright mural offered proof that sorrow could be transmuted into beauty. Yet amid this joy, a new rumor circulated in Willowbend. A real estate developer, different from Heartland, had begun quietly buying small parcels of land on the opposite side of town. Their motive wasn't clear, but it pricked at old anxieties. Was this the start of a more discreet attempt to commercialize the area? Howell frowned when he heard snippets of this in the local diner. He recalled how firmly he'd said no to Heartland Developments and wondered if these new investors were hoping to slip into Willowbend unnoticed. Patrick, noticing Howell's concern, asked if they should investigate. "We can't let them ruin what's been built," he said, but Howell counseled patience. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Folks can sell their land if they wish. We'll see if it threatens the orchard or the spirit we've created." Patrick nodded, though unease lingered. The orchard had become a symbol of unity, and neither man wanted to watch that vanish. For now, they returned to the orchard's tasks, pruning branches that needed shaping, watering the newly planted saplings in the far field, trusting that they would face future challenges as a community, just like before. As May approached, the weather turned gentle, and the orchard's flowers gave way to tiny green nubs that would soon swell into apples. The barn's mural, shining under daily sunshine, attracted travelers who snapped photos from the roadside. Some wrote short blog posts about the little farm with a big story, praising Howell and the donkey. The donkey, eager for attention, seemed to pose whenever a camera was near. Town officials even considered adding a sign on the highway to guide tourists seeking a slice of Willowbend's revival. Howell merely shrugged, amused at the idea of his farm turning into a modest landmark. He'd never aimed for fame. He only wanted to keep the promise he made to his father, and to himself, to preserve the land. Now, every day that promise grew easier to fulfill, thanks to the orchard's blossoming bounty and the unwavering support from neighbors. And whenever doubts surfaced, Howell would walk to the barn's exterior, run his fingertips across the painted orchard blossoms, and remember that this transformation was real. Sargent would nudge him, as if to say, "Keep going." And Howell would nod, content in the knowledge that genuine fellowship had taken root here, deeper than any corporate interest could reach. Warmth flooded Willowbend as May glided toward June, ushering in bright mornings and languid evenings. The orchard at Howell Farm, now brimming with miniature apples, drew almost as many visitors as the barn's cheerful mural. Children clutched grandparents' hands along the rows, pointing at each swelling fruit. High school students, fresh from final exams, lounged on blankets near the orchard's edge, sketching or snapping photos. And with each passing day, Patrick jotted down new observations in his notebook, enthralled by the orchard's subtle changes. When not tending apple trees, Howell and Patrick tackled chores all across the property. They fixed a short stone wall behind the farmhouse, mended a worn stretch of pasture fence, and started building simple trellises for climbing vegetables. Sargent the donkey, wearing a bandana around his neck that a local seamstress had stitched, supervised every step with comedic solemnity. Sometimes he let out an indignant bray that made them all laugh. The donkey's carefree presence, ironically, reminded Howell to stay watchful for problems, particularly the rumored real estate firm that had begun acquiring parcels nearby. One late afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher arrived with news that the developer was called Pine Hill Ventures. They had been purchasing small tracts around Willowbend's southern boundary, apparently coaxing landowners with enticing sums. Nobody had yet determined Pine Hill's ultimate motive, but bits of rumor suggested they might build a recreation complex or even subdivide for new housing. The tension that had briefly subsided after Heartland's proposal now returned, prickling the edges of the farm's serenity. Howell listened gravely, recalling the vow he'd made to preserve the orchard and the spirit of communal rebirth. "Could they threaten the orchard itself?" asked Patrick, brow creased. Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "Not if Howell doesn't sell. But if neighbors around him give in, the landscape could be transformed. You might find fancy developments casting shadows over the orchard." Howell pressed a hand to the porch railing, feeling a stirring of unease. Even if the orchard remained physically intact, a ring of modern houses or a bustling tourist facility might choke the quiet farmland he'd fought so hard to protect. He tried to reassure himself that his portion of Willowbend was safe. Still, he noticed how folks at the diner now discussed investment speculation and property lines with hushed anxiety. One elderly couple admitted to receiving an offer from Pine Hill that nearly matched the total value of their small ranch. "We could retire in comfort," they confessed, guilt shading their voices. Howell understood their dilemma. For people scraping by, that kind of money was no small temptation. Amid these tensions, Willow Bend's spring fair drew closer. The school planned to host it on the local high school's athletic field, featuring student-made displays about local lore and progress. To Howell's mild dismay, he was invited to speak at the opening ceremony. Town officials insisted he deliver a short talk on how a single act of kindness revitalized our community. He couldn't well refuse, not after all the orchard had come to represent. So he nervously drafted a speech, scrawling bullet points in a battered notepad. Patrick offered to help, but Howell wanted to keep his words authentic, even if they came out clumsy. On a bright Saturday in June, the fair began. Booths fanned out around the track, displaying crafts and baked goods. The air smelled of popcorn and fresh lemonade. Families meandered from stall to stall, sampling homemade fudge and trying ring toss games. A modest stage stood at the field's center, where a microphone waited. Howell, adjusting his collar, stood near the bleachers with Patrick and Mrs. Fletcher, heart hammering in his chest. At noon, the principal tapped the mic, welcoming all and praising the many volunteers who made Willowbend the friendliest place this side of the state line. Applause erupted, echoing in the warm breeze. Then the principal introduced Howell, calling him the man whose old farm became the heart of our town's renewal. Blushing, Howell trudged on stage. He looked out over the crowd, children perched on parents' shoulders, teachers in bright t-shirts, neighbors who'd come to trust him, and some unfamiliar faces who might well be from Pine Hill or beyond. He cleared his throat. "I'm not used to speeches," he began, voice quavering. "But I've seen how a little kindness can do wonders. Last year I invited folks for a free dinner at my place. I did it because I wanted to share whatever I had, even if it wasn't much. Back then, folks mocked me or pitied me. But somehow, that evening cracked open something in this town. It reminded us we needed each other, even if pride got in the way." He paused, scanning the attentive faces. "Later on, the Army rolled in, unexpected as can be, honoring my old service. That's when many of you realized I wasn't just a stubborn old man clinging to worthless land. But truth is, the land was never worthless. What I hope everyone sees now is that Willowbend's real wealth is in our unity. We can't buy that with any developer's check." A hush fell, broken only by a baby's coo. "Some of you," Howell continued, "might get offers that seem too good to pass up. I'm no judge. But please remember that if we let big development tear us apart, we might lose the spirit we fought so hard to reclaim. The orchard my father handed down to me is more than a field of trees. It's a place where neighbors become family. I'm grateful for all we've built together, and I pray we keep building." He ended with a simple thank you, then stepped back from the mic. For a moment the crowd was silent, and Howell worried he'd fumbled his words. But suddenly applause broke out, cheers rising from the bleachers. Tears shone in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. Patrick beamed. Even teenage bystanders clapped, though they typically played it cool. Howell exhaled, relieved his nerves hadn't completely betrayed him. He made his way off stage, heart hammering, comforted by the knowledge that maybe his message had landed. The rest of the fair passed in a blur. Children showcased dioramas of Willowbend's past. One group had built a tiny replica of Howell's orchard, complete with a toy donkey. Another group had crocheted a patchwork quilt depicting the barn mural. Howell and Patrick wandered from booth to booth, sampling sweet pies, admiring crafts. The donkey, for once, stayed home. Someone joked that he'd attract more attention than the students. Laughter and conversation swirled, buoyed by a sense of pride in their small town. Late afternoon saw the crowd thinning. While waiting in line for lemonade, Howell felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a woman in a sharp business outfit, her hair twisted into a neat bun. "Mr. Howell, I represent Pine Hill Ventures. My name is Eliza." She offered a thin-lipped smile. "Loved your speech. It's clear how much you value Willowbend's charm." He kept a neutral expression. "Thank you," he said curtly. She continued, "We'd like to talk about a potential partnership. We're not here to bulldoze your orchard. Quite the contrary, we think sustainable tourism could highlight farmland traditions." Howell braced himself, scanning the woman's polished demeanor. She radiated confidence, not the pushy air Heartland's rep once had, but a subtle intensity that might be harder to dismiss. Eliza pressed a glossy pamphlet into his hand. "We propose a limited eco-resort concept, working with local farms like yours, to offer tours, orchard experiences, even donkey-led nature walks. It could be beneficial for you and the whole community." Howell held the pamphlet, glimpsing pictures of rustic cabins and scenic farmland trails. It looked inviting, but also suspiciously curated. "Appreciate the info," he replied, voice steady. "But I'm not sure we're interested. We're proud of what we have, like I said on stage." Eliza's eyes flickered, though she maintained her pleasant tone. "Of course. Just know we want a cooperative approach, not a hostile takeover. Sometimes staying afloat in these times requires forward-thinking solutions." Before Howell could respond, Mrs. Fletcher appeared, handing him an extra cup of lemonade. Eliza took that as her cue to withdraw, offering a quick smile. Howell stared at the pamphlet, stomach twisting in knots. He recognized the pitch. They'd promise environmental sensitivity and local partnerships, only to expand into something bigger once they had a foothold. And the mention of donkey-led tours? That gave him a grim chuckle. Sargent was beloved, but turning him into a tourist gimmick felt exploitative. "I see they've made their move," Mrs. Fletcher sighed, noticing the pamphlet. He nodded. "They're slick, all right. We'd better keep our guard up." The fair ended as the sun dipped behind the bleachers, leaving Howell uneasy beneath the day's success. Over the next week, talk of Pine Hill Ventures heightened. Some landowners felt wary of eco-resort claims, but others, especially those in precarious financial positions, were intrigued. Meanwhile, the orchard blossomed with rosy fruit that promised a bumper crop. Patrick spent dawn to dusk setting up protective nets to ward off birds, while Howell strategized how best to sell or distribute the harvest. In quiet moments, Howell ran his fingers along the orchard's sturdy trunks, whispering a silent oath not to let opportunists hollow out what had been so dearly rebuilt. Days grew longer, nights gentler. The orchard hummed with a quiet sense of oncoming abundance, the heavy laden branches trembling in summer's breezes. Yet beneath that peaceful surface lay tension. Howell sensed Willowbend teetering on a threshold. Either they would hold tight to their renewed identity, or they would succumb to the lure of outsiders promising wealth. He refused to see the orchard become a mere backdrop for corporate marketing. But how far would Pine Hill push, and how many neighbors would yield to their offers? Despite the questions swirling in his mind, Howell focused on the orchard's daily tasks. He and Patrick worked side by side, battling insects, pruning the densest growth, and building crates for the fruit soon to arrive. Every time Howell glimpsed the donkey's cheerful face or saw neighbors carrying produce to the local food pantry, he reminded himself that solidarity had triumphed once before. Perhaps it would again. And if Pine Hill threatened to undo their progress, Willowbend had more than enough heart to stand firm. A stifling heat wave claimed Willowbend as summer arrived in full force. Day after day of unbroken sunshine baked the fields, turning dirt paths to dust and sending folks in search of shade. Howell's orchard thrived beneath this furnace-like sky, its apple clusters swelling and blushing. But the relentless heat also pushed him and Patrick to water the trees early each morning, standing for hours with hoses and irrigation lines, ensuring not a single branch withered. Sergeant the donkey complained in loud brays, flicking his ears at the persistent gnats. Yet, there was no denying the orchard seemed poised for a record-breaking harvest. If they managed to gather the fruit in time, Howell might have enough yield to fill every produce order around the county. All the while, Pine Hill Ventures pressed on with their discreet acquisitions. Rumors grew that they'd bought parcels east of the orchard. One belonged to a longtime family who, citing health problems, needed quick money. Another tract came from a landowner who had never farmed successfully and jumped at a profitable exit. Townspeople divided in their reactions. Some saw Pine Hill's involvement as an inevitable wave of progress, while others whispered about how quickly a place could change when corporations sniffed out potential. In the diner, heated arguments flared between those who believed Willowbend needed outside capital and those who insisted the farm renaissance was enough of a path forward. Against this backdrop, Patrick approached Howell one late afternoon, sweat staining his shirt from a day of orchard chores. "We keep hearing Pine Hill talk about eco-friendly expansions, but half the people they buy from vanish right after the sale," he said, lowering his voice as if the orchard itself might overhear. "I tried asking around at the post office, but folks just shrug. They say the land's sold, and that's that." Howell nodded grimly. "Then we need to show a better way. Prove that farmland can thrive without selling out." He gazed at the orchard canopy, alive with shimmering leaves. "We can't force folks to follow suit, but maybe the harvest will remind them what we stand for. Something real." Determined to harness the orchard's bounty for local benefit, Howell decided it was time to scale up. He contacted the agricultural extension agent for advice on packaging, distribution, and licensing. Mrs. Fletcher helped design simple labels: Howell Orchard, a community legacy. Meanwhile, Patrick offered to test a cider-making process in a corner of the barn, using a borrowed press from a friend in a neighboring town. The operation was small, just enough to produce a few barrels, but they hoped it would spark interest. If the orchard's harvest matched predictions, they'd have apples to spare for cider, pies, and direct sales, revenue that could fortify Willowbend's local economy before Pine Hill sank deeper roots. The orchard's turning point arrived in mid-July. One morning, Howell and Patrick strolled among the rows, shading their eyes from the blazing sun. They tested apples on random trees, biting into crisp flesh that dripped sweet juice. Howell smacked his lips in delight. "They're just about ready," he announced. "Maybe another week or two, and we can start picking the earliest varieties." On hearing that, Patrick beamed as if Christmas had come early. He scrambled back to the barn to finalize crate counts and recruit volunteers. The orchard's first proper harvest in years, one that could flood local markets, was about to unfold. Word spread fast. Neighbors and even high school students on summer break offered to help. The orchard's success had become personal to them, a symbol of Willowbend's resilience. Some families who had once scoffed at Howell now lined up to be part of the picking crews. They rummaged in closets for straw hats, borrowed sturdy gloves, and arrived at dawn, ready to fill baskets with apples gleaming in the morning light. Sergeant patrolled each row, occasionally sneaking a bite of fallen fruit. The donkey's shameless theft drew laughter from the pickers, who found the orchard's sense of camaraderie sweeter than any paycheck. During the harvest's first week, sweat and laughter mingled in equal measure. Voices bounced between rows of trees, calling for extra baskets or more water. In the barn, crates stacked higher each day, smelling of ripe fruit that exuded a faint perfume. Patrick kept track of the numbers on a whiteboard, delighted as the count soared. Mrs. Fletcher organized a rotating schedule, ensuring no single group worked too many hours in the punishing heat. They nicknamed themselves Team Orchard, scrawling little jokes on crates destined for local grocers. Families who had never shared more than polite nods discovered easy conversation over the rhythmic pluck of apples from branches. Halfway through the second week, the orchard hit peak production. Crates spilled over with plump fruit, requiring additional storage. Howell arranged for a few spare rooms in a neighbor's shed, while Patrick helped tie tarps across open trailer beds. They even borrowed a small refrigerated truck from the local dairy farm for the more delicate varieties. Night after night, the volunteers gathered in the barn to celebrate the day's haul, wiping sweat from their foreheads and chugging icy lemonade. Howell, though exhausted, felt an energy thrumming in his veins. This was how farmland was meant to be used, feeding people, forging bonds, standing tall on its own merits. Yet storm clouds loomed, figuratively if not literally. Throughout the harvest, Pine Hill representatives circulated, handing out flyers that claimed they could scale up orchard production even further. They approached volunteers during breaks, touting innovative orchard technology, bigger marketing budgets, and possible expansions. Some listened politely, intrigued by the promise of bigger payouts, but many bristled. They recognized that Pine Hill's pitch was less about farmland stewardship and more about corporate branding. Howell found himself quietly telling pickers, "We're proving we can succeed without them," hoping the tangible crates of fruit would speak louder than any pamphlet. It all came to a head when Eliza, the polished spokeswoman from Pine Hill, returned to Howell Farm on a scorching Tuesday. She arrived in a sleek SUV just as picking crews were breaking for lunch. Spotting Howell and Patrick by the barn, she strode over, a friendly smile plastered on her face. "This place is buzzing," she remarked. "I see you're benefiting from community spirit, but imagine if we joined forces. We could expand your orchard acreage, bring in advanced irrigation systems, guarantee huge distribution deals." Howell wiped sweat from his brow. "We're doing fine on our own," he replied gently, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way." Undeterred, Eliza held out a slick binder. "Take a look, please. We're not your enemy. We want a partnership, 50-50 on paper, giving you partial ownership, but letting our expertise guide you to bigger gains." Patrick, who'd been holding a crate of apples, interjected, "You mean letting a corporation run the orchard while Mr. Howell becomes a figurehead? No thanks." Eliza's gaze flicked over him, her practiced smile faltering. "That's a bleak interpretation. We believe in synergy, not puppetry. My team respects what you've built here." She gestured at the orchard rows. "But sometimes, idealism can limit potential." Howell felt weariness seep into his bones. He remembered the heartbreak of watching farmland sold off decades ago to people who never cherished it. Glancing at Patrick, he saw a younger reflection of his own determination. "I'm grateful for your interest," he told Eliza, "but my orchard's about more than yield. It's about belonging and trust. We've worked hard to unite this community." She studied him a long moment, then snapped the binder shut. "You might regret refusing," she said softly. "Once we finalize our other projects, your orchard may stand alone in a sea of modern development. Don't let your legacy become an afterthought." With that ominous remark, she turned, heels crunching on gravel, and departed. Patrick exhaled. "I don't like her tone," he muttered. Howell frowned. "That's a warning. They're planning something bigger." Quietly, they walked back to the barn. The hush of orchard labor resumed behind them, but Howell's thoughts lingered on Eliza's words. If Pine Hill managed to transform enough of Willow Bend's outskirts, Howell Farm might end up surrounded by commercial ventures. The orchard, though healthy, could become an island in a sprawling sea of development. He wondered if neighbors would keep resisting offers, or if desperation might tilt them toward Pine Hill's promises. Yet at dusk, as the picking crew finished stacking crates, Howell surveyed the day's bounty. Hundreds of apples glistened in the lantern light, ready to ship to local markets. The sight reminded him that Willow Bend's best defense lay in its unity and proven success. They had revived a once disparaged orchard into a thriving enterprise that fed families, employed local hands, and fostered an abiding spirit. Perhaps that story would be powerful enough to keep Pine Hill at bay, or perhaps a more direct confrontation loomed on the horizon. Mrs. Fletcher arrived with a fresh pot of stew, feeding the tired volunteers. Through mouthfuls, they recounted daily highlights, from Sargent's comedic attempts to swipe apples to a young child discovering a bird's nest in the orchard. Laughter rippled through the barn. Howell soaked it in like an elixir, resolved to guard what they had built. That night he lay awake, listening to the orchard's subtle rustle beneath the hot wind, and clutched the donkey's muzzle when it poked through his window. In the face of Pine Hill's overtures, Howell found solace in the orchard's heartbeat, a living tapestry of sweat, hope, and an unwavering refusal to let greed uproot what had grown so dear. The orchard's harvest continued, unrelenting under the fierce summer sun. Each morning, teams sorted apples by size and quality, then loaded them into trucks that rumbled across dusty roads toward local stores. When evening settled, Howell and Patrick sat outside on the porch, listening to the cheerful hum of insects. Sometimes, neighbors stayed for supper, sharing updates on Pine Hill's progress. A new rumor claimed the company planned a model eco-community just a mile away. It sounded harmless on paper, with talk of solar panels and green spaces, but no one believed it would stay so modest for long. The tension that had simmered for months now felt ready to boil. One Friday, a letter arrived for Howell from a legal firm representing Pine Hill. It was polite in tone, if unsettling. They cordially invited him to a public forum about the future development of Willow Bend. The meeting, to be held in the town hall next week, would allow the company to present their proposals and gather community feedback. Patrick clenched his jaw at the invitation, suspecting it was merely a tactic to force Howell into open debate. But Howell, after a long silent moment, said quietly, "We'll attend. If they want a discussion, we'll give them one." Word of the planned forum spread fast, stirring debate throughout Willow Bend. Some insisted that if Pine Hill truly believed in respectful partnership, they wouldn't have pressured so many landowners behind closed doors. Others, more open-minded, argued that hearing Pine Hill out might lead to beneficial compromises. The orchard volunteers remained wary, wanting to protect the renewed farmland from commercialization that could undermine the place's spirit. Yet, for all the talk, no one knew exactly what Pine Hill intended. Only that they had spent a small fortune accumulating property for months. On the day of the forum, late afternoon heat pressed down. Around 6 o'clock, townspeople crowded into the modest town hall, fanning themselves with pamphlets or hats. Folding chairs spread across the room, and a stage at the front bore a small podium. Howell and Patrick arrived early, taking seats near Mrs. Fletcher in the second row. Sargent the donkey had been left at the farm, for obvious reasons. Someone joked that if the donkey charged in, Pine Hill might claim it as a marketing attraction. As the hall filled, Howell recognized many orchard volunteers and a smattering of landowners rumored to be on the fence about selling. At 7 sharp, the mayor stepped up, tapping the microphone. He greeted everyone, his forehead dotted with sweat. "We're here to discuss Pine Hill Ventures development plans," he explained. "They've prepared a presentation, and we'll open the floor to public questions afterward." A polite smattering of applause followed as 3 individuals rose from the front row. Eliza, dressed in a neat linen suit, introduced herself and her colleagues, each wearing polished smiles. Immediately, a projector screen behind them flickered to life, displaying digital slides of tree-lined paths and solar-roofed cottages. Eliza began with a practiced, confident voice. "Thank you for coming. Pine Hill Ventures admires Willow Bend's charm and strong sense of community. Our goal is to enhance that by offering sustainable housing, ecotourism, and carefully managed commercial zones. We want to partner with local farmers to expand orchard production, honeybee cultivation, and artisanal workshops." On screen, images of families gathering apples flashed by, eerily reminiscent of scenes from Howell's farm. Eliza pointed at the slides, describing nature trails, farm stays, and educational programs. She paused occasionally to note the success of existing orchard operations, glancing pointedly in Howell's direction. Initially, the crowd listened in stiff silence, but as Eliza went on, some folks began nodding. Her pitch sounded polished, forward-thinking, and environmentally friendly. Yet others looked uneasy, especially those who'd seen Pine Hill's high-pressure tactics. When the final slide presented a proposed map showing Pine Hill's purchased parcels ringing much of Willow Bend's outer edges, a murmur rippled through the hall. Howell's property stood untouched in the center like an island. Eliza wrapped up the slideshow with a bright smile. "We've reached out to Mr. Howell, whose orchard we admire, to collaborate. We firmly believe Willow Bend can enter a prosperous new era without losing its soul." After the applause died down, the mayor opened the floor for questions. At once, Mrs. Fletcher raised her hand. "You say you won't destroy Willow Bend's character, but what safeguards prevent you from flipping these developments into chain stores or mass tourism if profits beckon?" Eliza responded that Pine Hill's charter guaranteed ecological respect, but she offered no specifics. A second question from the hardware store owner was more pointed. Who decides if local businesses are overshadowed by new Pine Hill shops? Eliza mentioned market synergy, but again avoided concrete details. Frustration built until Howell slowly stood. The hall fell silent, watching him approach the microphone. Even Eliza's polished composure faltered. Howell cleared his throat. "I run the orchard you mentioned. It's done just fine with local cooperation. We don't need fancy packaging or expansions that drain our identity. Your slides show pleasant images, but I've heard how your associates pressured folks to sell. This orchard used to be a laughingstock until the community rediscovered its worth. Isn't that real progress?" A ripple of approval spread through the crowd. Eliza attempted a calm retort. "Mr. Howell, I respect your orchard's journey, but not everyone in Willow Bend has your resources or volunteer support. Our developments could bring stable jobs, better infrastructure, and a broader audience for the region's produce. We see synergy, not conflict." She nodded at her colleagues, who projected nodding sincerity. But Howell pressed on, voice steadier now. "And once you control that land, what's to stop you from morphing those eco-resorts into highways of tourists? What if small farms can't keep pace with your corporate scale? We'd lose the very closeness that revived Willow Bend." An older rancher stood, acknowledging Pine Hill had offered him a large sum for his property. "I'm torn," he admitted. "That money would help my retirement, but I worry about the aftermath." A hush followed, underscoring the dilemma many faced. Some eyes flicked to Howell's orchard success, while others drifted to Eliza's images of modern amenities. Tension thickened as the mayor tried to keep order, reminding everyone to speak in turns. The next hour brought a flurry of questions and guarded answers. Pine Hill touted hypothetical job creation. Locals worried about changing the town's character. For every worry about over-commercialization, Eliza mentioned green building practices and community feedback sessions. The meeting ended inconclusively, with the mayor promising a follow-up. Outside, the crowd dispersed into muggy night air. Voices hushed. Some muttered that Pine Hill's promises sounded too good to be true. Others found a glimmer of hope for improved roads and commerce. Back at the farm, Howell and Patrick sat in the barn's open doorway, letting the donkey roam around them. "I'm not sure how many folks left that meeting convinced," Patrick sighed. Howell nodded. "But Pine Hill isn't leaving. They'll charm people with shining brochures, mention climate-friendly ideas, and slip contracts under doors." He kicked at loose straw. "All we can do is keep showing that real progress grows from within, not from a corporate blueprint. Our orchard stands for something genuine, and we have to protect that." Sargent nudged Howell's arm as if to agree. The old man scratched the donkey's ears, feeling a resolve stiffen in his gut. In the days after the forum, heated debate flared across Willow Bend. Letters to the local paper alternated between praising Pine Hill's environmental angle and accusing them of deceitful land grabbing. A few neighbors publicly announced deals with Pine Hill, citing the need to secure their finances. Others reaffirmed support for local initiatives like Howell's Orchard or the expanding farmers market. At times, the discourse grew bitter. One resident accused Howell of using orchard volunteers to stifle development, calling him the old guard who fears change. Howell read that letter with a pang of hurt, but steadied himself by recalling the orchard's first community harvest. In an effort to unify those on the fence, Mrs. Fletcher proposed a harvest festival at Howell Farm, inviting all local farmers, even those who'd sold parcels to Pine Hill. She hoped the orchard's bounty and the barn mural would remind everyone of Willow Bend's transformation. Howell agreed, despite suspecting Pine Hill might see it as competition. The date was set for late August, when the orchard's second wave of apples would be ripe. Patrick and the volunteers planned music, games, and tours of the orchard, envisioning a day of joyous celebration. Maybe, just maybe, it would help residents feel less tempted by Pine Hill's money. One humid afternoon, Howell surveyed the orchard, reacquainting himself with every row. He pictured the festival, bright banners, children racing around trees, Sargent trotting with a ribbon in his mane, the barn mural gleaming in the sun. Beneath that hopeful vision, a swirl of anxiety churned. Pine Hill wasn't just a name on brochures. It was a force with deep pockets and cunning marketing. Could a single harvest festival outweigh corporate might? After all, big checks had already coaxed some landowners away. But Howell took a breath. He remembered the free dinner that had ignited Willow Bend's renewal, remembered the army ceremony that caught everyone off guard, and realized improbable victories could happen. If enough hearts aligned, maybe they could safeguard the orchard's future yet again. That night, he penned a simple announcement for the festival, printing copies at home. He taped them to the diner's bulletin board, the library entrance, and the post office wall. Patrick mailed a stack to out-of-town supporters who might visit. Then, they waited for responses, forging ahead with orchard chores in the searing heat. Each day, the donkey lapped extra water from a trough while bees buzzed among the orchard blooms that had blossomed late. Howell prayed for a gentle rain to ease the dryness, though meteorologists promised the heat wave might linger. In the hush before sunrise, he'd stand at the orchard's edge, donkey by his side, and watch the eastern horizon lighten. Perhaps it was foolish to hope a single festival could shift the tide. But Howell believed that if the orchard had taught them anything, it was that seeds of unity, once planted, could flourish in the unlikeliest conditions. As August shimmered with unrelenting heat, excitement for Howell Farm's upcoming harvest festival spread through Willow Bend like a welcome breeze. Posters featuring orchard scenes and a grinning donkey decorated shop windows, reminding everyone to join the celebration. Though many families worried about Pine Hill Ventures and the uncertain future, they clung to the hope that a lively gathering might rekindle unity. Patrick worked tirelessly, constructing a makeshift stage behind the barn for local musicians who volunteered their talents. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fletcher arranged games and craft booths, ensuring every age group would find delight. Howell, feeling both nervous and hopeful, roamed the orchard at dawn, checking fruit clusters that ripened daily. Each day, volunteers paused to admire the barn's bright mural, drawing courage from its vivid story. Summer joys persisted endlessly. In the final week before the festival, Howell and Patrick gathered orchard crates and assembled fresh displays to feature apples at various stages of ripeness. Families practiced folk dances, while the local fiddler rehearsed tunes meant to fill the barnyard with toe-tapping rhythms. Sergeant the donkey oversaw preparations, occasionally nudging unsuspecting helpers with his muzzle. Mrs. Fletcher enlisted youth volunteers to paint colorful banners, one proclaiming, "Orchard Harvest, our town, our roots." Rumors swirled that Pine Hill might attend, hoping to mingle and sway any waverers. Unfazed, Howell pressed forward, determined to showcase honest farmland labor and the orchard's bounty. Each afternoon, helpers hosed dust from the barn's mural, ensuring every painted blossom gleamed for visitors. In quiet moments, Howell wondered if unity could triumph again, renewing shared purpose effortlessly. At dawn on festival day, the air carried a much-needed crispness, as though granting Willowbend temporary relief from the heat. Volunteers bustled onto Howell's property, erecting pop-up tents for baked goods, cider samples, and arts demonstrations. A half-dozen bright ribbons fluttered along the orchard entrance, where families would soon stroll amid laden apple branches. Patrick directed parking near the newly trimmed pasture, ensuring no visitor crushed sensitive plants. Sergeant posed with children, who giggled at his ribbon-covered harness. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fletcher finished setting up an information booth, displaying flyers on local charities born from Howell's initial free dinner. Watching the flurry of final touches, Howell felt a surge of gratitude. Today, more than any day before, showcased how far they'd come. He prayed no corporate ambition could overshadow this harmony. By mid-morning, cars and tractors lined the roadside, delivering hundreds of eager attendees. Laughter drifted from the orchard, where families collected plump apples in wicker baskets. Local artisans sold handmade jams and quilts, while the school choir performed on Patrick's makeshift stage. Music mingled with the sweet aroma of roasting corn and freshly pressed cider. Couples strolled past the barn, pausing to admire its mural, cameras clicking like cheerful applause. Howell, wearing his best old hat, guided small groups along orchard rows, explaining pruning techniques and natural pest control. Sergeant trailed behind, occasionally accepting carrot offerings. Some older folks reminisced about how they once ridiculed Howell's farm, marveling at this vibrant transformation. The festival's spirit rang loud and clear. Cooperation had outshone past doubt, blossoming into something solid and hopeful. Around noon, a sleek Pine Hill SUV appeared at the farm's entrance, drawing uncertain stares. Eliza, impeccably dressed despite the heat, stepped out with two associates. Her expression stayed cordial as she surveyed the lively scene. Some volunteers tensed, fearing disruption. Yet Eliza greeted Howell politely, praising the festival's success. She admitted Pine Hill could learn from such community-centered collaboration. Howell, recalling her ominous warnings, offered only terse thanks. Undeterred, Eliza wandered between booths, occasionally chatting with residents. Though her presence unsettled some, nothing overtly confrontational occurred. Still, Patrick noticed her associates quietly taking photos, jotting notes. An older farmer confided that Eliza asked pointed questions about orchard yields, farm expansions, and possible bed and breakfast add-ons. Pine Hill seemed eager to glean intel without stirring drama. The tension buzzed like static. Midway through the afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher guided everyone toward the main stage for a brief presentation. Children, apple-cheeked and sticky-fingered, gathered at the front, while older folks claimed nearby hay bales. Patrick introduced the orchard volunteers, each stepping forward to light applause. Then Mrs. Fletcher recounted how Howell's simple dinner invitation evolved into a collective rebirth, culminating in today's festival. Howell avoided the spotlight until a chant of "Speech" erupted from the crowd. Flustered yet touched, he shuffled to the microphone, quieting the cheers with a raised hand. In a few soft words, he thanked everyone for standing beside him, reminding them that unity, not money, had breathed life into the orchard. Applause thundered, and even some Pine Hill supporters clapped, reluctant admiration shining through. The moment felt both uplifting and triumphant. Once Howell stepped down, Eliza unexpectedly took the stage, her associates close behind. Polite clapping rippled through the crowd, though unease shadowed some faces. Eliza commended Willowbend's warmth, praising Howell's leadership and promising Pine Hill would never undermine that spirit. Yet her tone shifted as she proposed that the orchard embrace strategic partnership for global visibility, invoking the same corporate pitch as before. A few orchard volunteers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the sales angle behind her flattery. Eliza concluded with a polished smile, promising that Pine Hill would submit detailed proposals soon. Polite applause followed, but the atmosphere crackled with skepticism. Moments later, she left the stage, beaming as though confident she'd planted seeds of doubt. Howell grimaced, realizing Pine Hill wasn't easily deterred, even here in his orchard's heart. The late afternoon sun glowed orange over the orchard, illuminating families sharing final slices of pie and glasses of fresh cider. Laughter still echoed, though conversation occasionally veered toward Pine Hill. Patrick circulated, encouraging guests to sign a guest book titled Why Willowbend Matters. Each entry reflected gratitude, recalling how small gestures sparked big changes. Meanwhile, Howell wandered among the orchard rows, letting the rustling leaves steady his thoughts. Sargent trailed faithfully, swatting flies with his tail. At one point, Howell paused before a particularly robust tree, trunk thick from seasons of survival. He gently patted the bark, acknowledging how far they'd come. The orchard thrived, not through corporate expansions, but through human connection. Even if Pine Hill advanced, the memory of this festival would burn bright in Willowbend's collective memory. As evening settled, festival goers gathered near the barn for a closing circle. Lanterns glowed, illuminating orchard crates stacked with leftover apples. Mrs. Fletcher led a short reflection, praising everyone who had contributed to the day's success. Children yawned, clutching ribbons they'd won in sack races, while teens exchanged phone snaps of donkey selfies. Howell accepted quiet thanks from neighbors, who assured him they wouldn't let Pine Hill overshadow the orchard's achievements. Patrick pulled out a guitar, striking gentle chords. The group sang a simple folk tune, voices mingling under the star-flecked sky. Even Eliza and her associates, observing from the sidelines, seemed momentarily transfixed. When the last note faded, soft applause followed, carrying an undercurrent of resolve. If Pine Hill advanced, Willowbend would stand ready, braced by orchard roots unbroken. That night, after guests departed and lanterns dimmed, Howell remained by the barn, gazing at the moonlit orchard. Patrick and Sargent approached, both weary yet content. The donkey nudged Howell's shoulder gently, as if seeking reassurance. Howell stroked the donkey's neck, recalling his long journey from isolation to this thriving fellowship. He shut his eyes, hearing echoes of music and laughter lingering in warm summer air. Tomorrow, Pine Hill might push harder, or neighbors might waver under financial strain. But tonight, the orchard belonged to unity and hope. Howell pictured the future like branches arching toward dawn, laden with untested fruit. Whatever came, he trusted Willowbend would endure, nourished by steadfast hearts and the quiet power of a single meal shared long ago. Through orchard shadows, he whispered thanks, unafraid.